My family owes you a future." The words drifted across the grand ballroom so quietly that they should have disappeared beneath the music, yet somehow every conversation stopped at once. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors. Silver glasses shimmered beneath towering floral arrangements, and nearly 300 of the most influential people in Chicago found themselves staring at the same unexpected scene. Jonathan Ashford, billionaire chairman of Ashford Holdings, had just stepped away from the stage where he was supposed to celebrate the company's 60th anniversary. Investors, politicians, judges, and executives instinctively moved aside as he walked past them without acknowledging a single handshake. Cameras followed him. Reporters whispered. Even the string quartet seemed to lose its rhythm for a heartbeat. Jonathan continued toward the very back of the ballroom, where the catering staff quietly cleared empty plates before anyone noticed they were gone. Standing beside a linen cart was Naomi Carter, a 58-year-old black woman wearing a simple housekeeping uniform with neatly pressed sleeves and comfortable black shoes that had carried her through countless 12-hour shifts. She lowered her eyes politely as the billionaire approached, assuming he needed directions or perhaps wished to compliment the hotel staff. Instead, Jonathan stopped only a few feet away and looked directly at her with an expression no one had ever seen on his composed face. It was not pride. It was not confidence. It looked remarkably like regret. Around them, dozens of expensive watches reflected the chandelier light as guests quietly checked the time, wondering whether this interruption had been carefully planned or had somehow escaped the evening's flawless schedule. Naomi glanced around, convinced there had been a mistake. People like Jonathan Ashford did not know people like her. They lived in different worlds separated by neighborhoods, opportunities, and generations of invisible barriers. She had spent more than 2 decades working wherever honest work could be found, cleaning offices before sunrise, polishing hotel corridors after midnight, and disappearing before important people arrived for meetings. Her name was rarely remembered, her kindness almost never announced. Yet she carried herself with quiet dignity because her late mother had always said that character stayed long after applause faded. Jonathan slowly reached inside the inner pocket of his tailored navy jacket, and an uneasy silence settled over the ballroom. Several members of the Ashford family's legal team exchanged confused looks. His executive assistant took one cautious step forward before stopping, sensing this moment belonged to something much older than corporate protocol. Jonathan carefully removed a faded ivory envelope whose edges had softened with age. The paper looked strangely fragile against the dark fabric of his suit, as though it had survived decades waiting for a single conversation. Naomi's breathing slowed as she noticed elegant handwriting across the front. She could not read every word from where she stood, but one detail caught her attention immediately. It was her name, written carefully, written deliberately, written as if someone had expected her to hold that envelope one day. Jonathan's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the letter before he lifted his eyes to meet hers again. The silence became heavier than any speech he had ever delivered, because every person in that magnificent ballroom suddenly understood they were no longer witnessing a celebration of wealth. They were standing at the beginning of a forgotten promise that time itself had failed to erase. Naomi Carter stood perfectly still because years of working in elegant places had taught her that silence often protected people who had very little power. Around her, expensive shoes rested on polished marble while quiet whispers spread faster than the music ever could. She could feel hundreds of curious eyes studying every detail of her faded housekeeping uniform, wondering why the most influential businessman in the room had stopped in front of someone they had barely noticed all evening. Naomi resisted the urge to step backward. She had spent more than 23 years making herself invisible inside buildings like this one, arriving before sunrise or staying long after midnight, leaving every hallway brighter than she found it without expecting anyone to remember her name. Her hands carried the gentle marks of honest work. Her calm smile had comforted nervous young employees on their first day, and more than one exhausted coworker had quietly admitted that Naomi always seemed to know exactly what kind words someone needed before another difficult shift. She never imagined that kindness could become something people would one day speak about beneath crystal chandeliers. Jonathan Ashford looked at her as though he recognized someone he should have known years earlier. That expression unsettled Naomi far more than the attention surrounding them. She searched his face, hoping memory might suddenly explain what was happening, but she saw only a stranger carrying a burden that appeared older than either of them wished to admit. The envelope remained steady in his hand, its yellowed edges revealing that it had survived countless seasons tucked safely away from light. Naomi noticed a faint scent of old paper drifting through the cool air whenever Jonathan adjusted his grip. It reminded her of the neighborhood library where she had spent quiet afternoons reading while waiting for her mother to finish cleaning offices across town. Books had always offered possibilities that life itself rarely provided. Long before she ever pushed a housekeeping cart through luxury hotels, Naomi had dreamed of becoming an elementary school teacher. She loved watching children discover confidence one sentence at a time, believing every child deserved someone who looked them in the eye and reminded them that their future mattered. But dreams slowly changed when medical bills arrived after her father's unexpected illness, followed by rent increases, family responsibilities, and one difficult decision after another. Every opportunity she postponed seemed temporary at first, until temporary quietly became permanent. Still, she never blamed anyone for the path her life had taken. She simply kept moving forward, believing dignity could exist inside ordinary work just as surely as it existed inside corner offices. Across the ballroom, several longtime members of the Ashford family exchanged uncertain glances, quietly asking one another whether Jonathan had mentioned any special guest before tonight. None of them recognized Naomi. None of them remembered seeing her face in old photographs hanging throughout the Ashford estate. Yet something about the aged envelope stirred uneasy expressions among the oldest family advisors, as though a forgotten chapter had unexpectedly reopened after remaining locked away for decades. Jonathan finally drew a slow breath before speaking again, but instead of addressing the guests or the cameras surrounding them, his attention never left Naomi. It was as if the celebration had disappeared entirely, leaving only two lives connected by a story that had waited far too many years to be told. Jonathan lowered his eyes to the envelope for a brief moment before carefully breaking the silence that had settled over the ballroom. His voice remained steady, yet every word carried the weight of someone reading from a memory instead of a prepared speech. He explained that only 3 weeks earlier, after his mother Evelyn Ashford passed away peacefully at the age of 86, he had begun the difficult process of closing the family estate. The mansion outside Lake Forest had stood for generations, filled with polished oak hallways, oil paintings, handwritten journals, and rooms untouched for decades. Hidden behind a bookshelf inside his late father's private study, workers discovered an old steel safe that no one living even knew existed. The combination had been written inside one of Richard Ashford's personal notebooks, tucked between business records that had never been meant for public eyes. Jonathan admitted that he expected to find financial documents, investment certificates, or forgotten property deeds. Instead, inside the safe rested only 3 objects: a faded photograph with softened corners, a tiny silver bracelet designed for a young child, and the ivory envelope now resting in his hand. The room remained completely still as he continued. The photograph showed a much younger Richard Ashford standing beside a smiling African-American woman in front of a small brick community center somewhere on the south side of Chicago. There were children gathered around them, laughing beneath bright summer sunshine. But one face had captured Jonathan's attention immediately. A young woman standing near the edge of the picture looked remarkably familiar. He had stared at the photograph for several minutes before finally realizing why. It was Naomi, younger by many years, with hopeful eyes and the same gentle smile she still carried tonight. Jonathan looked toward her again. Naomi slowly shook her head, almost unable to believe what she was hearing. She remembered volunteering at neighborhood reading programs during her early 20s, helping children with homework after finishing long workdays, but she had never imagined someone from the Ashford family had even noticed she was there. Jonathan explained that beneath the photograph had been a single handwritten note from his father that read, "If you have opened this safe, then I am no longer here to correct my greatest failure. Read the letter before you make another decision in this family's name." Jonathan admitted those words had kept him awake for nights. His father had built one of the most respected companies in the country, earned countless awards, and mentored generations of business leaders. Yet the final message he chose to leave behind was not about money or success. It was about a mistake, a deeply personal one. Harold Benson, the longtime Ashford family attorney, quietly lowered his head as though he finally understood why Richard had instructed him years earlier never to destroy certain confidential files regardless of how old they became. Several elderly board members exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing Richard's handwriting from thousands of documents signed throughout his career. This letter was unquestionably authentic. Jonathan carefully turned the envelope over so Naomi could see the front more clearly. Written in elegant blue ink across the center were 4 simple words that immediately stole the air from her lungs. Mrs. Naomi Carter. Personal. Deliver by hand. Jonathan slid one finger beneath the brittle seal and unfolded the letter with extraordinary care, as though every crease carried a piece of his father's unfinished life. The paper had faded into a warm shade of ivory, and the blue ink had softened with time, but Richard Ashford's handwriting remained unmistakably elegant. Jonathan drew a quiet breath before reading aloud. Dear Naomi, if these words have finally reached you, then I have waited far too long to tell you the truth. There is no business achievement, no fortune, and no family legacy that can erase the debt I owe you. Years ago, you gave my family something that money could never purchase. You gave us hope when we had already surrendered it. A murmur drifted through the ballroom before fading into silence again. Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken, yet she could not remember any moment in her life worthy of such gratitude. She searched through memories of ordinary days filled with bus rides, second jobs, grocery lists, and evening volunteer work, wondering what Richard Ashford could possibly be describing. Jonathan continued reading. More than 30 years earlier, during one unusually cold November evening, Richard's wife Evelyn had organized a literacy program at a neighborhood community center that quietly served struggling families. Jonathan had been only 8 years old. While executives canceled their visits because of the weather, Naomi had arrived anyway after completing a full shift at work. She spent hours reading stories to children whose parents were working late, never asking who belonged to wealthy families and who did not. Near closing time, young Jonathan wandered away from the activity room, frightened after becoming separated from his mother inside the unfamiliar building. Richard admitted in the letter that panic had overtaken everyone searching the dark hallways until Naomi calmly found the frightened boy sitting alone beside a storage room, wrapped her own winter coat around his shoulders, and stayed beside him until his parents arrived. She had asked for nothing in return, quietly leaving before anyone could even learn her full name. Jonathan paused, lowering the paper as forgotten images slowly returned to him. He remembered a gentle voice reading from a children's book. He remembered the comforting scent of cinnamon tea lingering on a borrowed scarf. Most clearly, he remembered someone telling him that courage sometimes looked like simply staying with another person until they no longer felt alone. Naomi's eyes glistened as fragments of that evening surfaced after so many years. She had completely forgotten the frightened little boy because, to her, comforting children had never been extraordinary. It was simply the right thing to do. Jonathan lifted the letter once more. Richard confessed that after learning Naomi hoped to become a teacher, he had privately promised himself he would help pay for her education. Yet before he fulfilled that promise, advisors convinced him that public involvement with community programs outside the family's charitable foundation would create unnecessary controversy and distract from major business negotiations already attracting national attention. Richard admitted with deep regret that he had listened to fear instead of conscience. He postponed helping Naomi once, then again, until the opportunity disappeared completely. The final lines trembled slightly in Jonathan's voice. My silence stole years that can never be returned. If my son is reading this now, I ask only one thing of him. Do not inherit my hesitation. Deliver this letter into Naomi Carter's hands, look her in the eyes, and honor the promise I failed to keep. The last sentence lingered in the air long after Jonathan lowered the letter. No one reached for a glass. No one whispered. The ballroom, so alive only minutes earlier, now felt almost sacred beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers. Naomi looked down at her weathered hands, unable to reconcile the ordinary life she had lived with the extraordinary apology she had just heard. She remembered the little boy with frightened eyes and a borrowed coat, but she had never expected that simple evening to echo across 3 decades. Before she could gather her thoughts, one of the senior board members slowly stepped forward. His expensive tuxedo contrasted sharply with Naomi's housekeeping uniform, yet the uncertainty in his expression made him appear suddenly smaller. "Jonathan," he said carefully, "your father's letter is moving, but surely this is a private family matter. There is no reason to involve the foundation or the company." Several executives nodded almost instinctively. Another investor quietly added that emotional decisions could easily be misunderstood by shareholders. Someone near the back suggested that generous compensation would be appropriate, but should remain confidential. The carefully chosen words sounded polite, yet every sentence seemed to place an invisible boundary around Naomi, as though gratitude could be acknowledged only if it stayed comfortably out of public view. Jonathan listened without interruption. His expression remained calm, but his eyes never left Naomi. Harold Benson adjusted his glasses and quietly unfolded another document from the leather folder he had been carrying throughout the evening. He spoke with the measured confidence of a man who had spent decades protecting both legal agreements and family histories. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, Richard Ashford anticipated this exact conversation. The room turned toward him. Harold explained that the letter had not been the only document inside the safe. There had also been signed legal instructions prepared years earlier, but never executed because Richard intended to deliver them personally. Their purpose, Harold explained, was not charity. They represented the fulfillment of an obligation Richard believed he had failed to honor. An uneasy silence spread across the front tables where several longtime advisors exchanged cautious glances. Naomi lifted her head immediately. "Please," she said softly, her voice gentle enough that people leaned closer simply to hear her. "You do not owe me anything. I helped the child because he needed someone beside him. That was enough then, and it is enough now." Her words carried no bitterness, no resentment, only quiet sincerity. The simplicity of her response settled over the ballroom more heavily than any dramatic speech could have. Jonathan's shoulders lowered slightly as though he had expected exactly that answer. "That is precisely why my father believed this debt could never be measured in dollars," he replied. "You walked away expecting nothing, while our family walked away carrying a promise that was never fulfilled." Naomi looked around the magnificent room filled with polished marble, crystal light, and faces she had spent years serving without ever standing among them. She felt no anger toward anyone present. She simply wished the evening could return to celebrating the employees who had quietly built the company together. Yet somewhere deep inside, she also realized this was no longer only about her. It was about whether a promise delayed for 30 years still had the power to become the truth. The applause that usually followed every announcement never came. Instead, Jonathan quietly folded his father's letter along the same delicate creases that had protected it for more than 30 years and placed it back inside the weathered envelope. Without another word, he stepped closer and gently held it out with both hands. Naomi hesitated before accepting it, almost afraid the fragile paper might disappear the moment her fingers touched it. The ballroom remained silent except for the faint melody of the string quartet, which had resumed so softly that it sounded more like a distant memory than live music. Naomi carefully traced the faded handwriting with her fingertips. The ink had aged, but the kindness behind each word felt strangely alive. For a long moment, she simply stood there, looking at the envelope instead of the hundreds of people watching her. Warm light from the crystal chandeliers reflected across its worn surface, revealing tiny creases left by years of careful handling. It was impossible to measure how much time had passed inside those folded pages. Jonathan watched quietly, allowing the silence to speak where explanations no longer could. He realized that every business negotiation he had ever completed had been measured in percentages, signatures, and deadlines. This moment could not be measured at all. Across the room, guests who had arrived expecting speeches about profits and expansion now found themselves reflecting on promises, missed opportunities, and the unexpected weight of ordinary kindness. A young waitress standing near the service entrance discreetly wiped a tear from her cheek before returning to her work. One of the photographers slowly lowered his camera, deciding that some moments deserved to be witnessed before they were documented. Harold Benson quietly closed his leather folder without saying another word. Even he understood that legal documents had reached the limit of what they could accomplish tonight. Naomi finally lifted her eyes toward Jonathan. There was no anger in her expression. There was no triumph either. Only quiet compassion for a family that had carried regret far longer than she had carried disappointment. "Your father remembered," she said softly. "That alone is a gift I never expected." Jonathan lowered his head for a brief moment. "He remembered every day," he answered. "He simply ran out of time before he found the courage to tell you." Those words settled gently over the room like the final snowflakes of a long winter. Naomi looked once more at the letter before carefully holding it against her heart. She thought about the young woman she had once been, full of dreams that slowly gave way to responsibility, believing those dreams had simply belonged to another lifetime. Yet standing beneath the warm lights of the ballroom, surrounded by strangers who no longer seemed quite so distant, she felt something she had not experienced in many years. It was not hope for wealth. It was not recognition. It was the quiet comfort of knowing that even when kindness appeared forgotten by the world, it could still live patiently inside another person's conscience, waiting for the day truth finally found its voice. Jonathan remained silent for several seconds before turning toward Harold Benson with a small nod. The elderly attorney opened his leather folder once again, but this time he removed a sealed document that looked much newer than the faded letter Naomi now held against her heart. Harold adjusted his glasses and spoke slowly enough that every word settled clearly across the ballroom. Richard Ashford prepared these instructions 12 years before his passing. He amended them twice, but one section never changed. Jonathan accepted the document and looked toward Naomi with quiet sincerity. "My father did not simply leave behind an apology," he said. "He left behind a decision." Curious whispers rippled through the guests before disappearing once more. Jonathan unfolded the papers and continued. Richard had established a private educational trust using a portion of his personal investments rather than company assets. Every dividend earned over the years had remained untouched because the trust had never been activated. According to the legal instructions, it could only become effective after one condition had been fulfilled. Naomi Carter had to receive the original handwritten letter in person, along with a full explanation of why the promise had been delayed. Until that happened, the account would remain locked indefinitely. Jonathan paused before looking back at Harold, who quietly confirmed every statement with a gentle nod. Several board members stared in disbelief. They had reviewed countless estate documents after Richard's passing, yet none of them had known this separate trust existed because it had been established privately through a different legal structure decades earlier. Harold calmly explained that Richard had feared anyone discovering the arrangement too early might convince him to replace it with an ordinary charitable donation. He never wanted this to become another public relations project. He wanted it to remain a personal promise. Jonathan slowly walked toward Naomi until only a few feet separated them. "The trust belongs to you," he said softly. "Not because you asked for it. Not because anyone feels sorry for you. It belongs to you because my father believed he took away opportunities that should have been yours." Naomi looked at him in complete disbelief. "I cannot accept something built from another person's regret," she answered gently. Jonathan smiled for the first time that evening, though his eyes remained filled with emotion. "Neither could my father," he replied. That is why he wrote another sentence beneath the legal instructions. He turned the final page and read aloud. "If Naomi refuses because she believes she deserves nothing, remind her that this gift was never intended to reward the past. It exists to create futures she would have built herself if I had honored my promise when it mattered most." The room fell silent again. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment as tears quietly gathered, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had carried this unfinished promise through every season of his life. Around the ballroom, expressions softened one by one. The discussion was no longer about money, inheritance, or reputation. It had become something far greater. It was about the quiet courage required to admit a mistake, even if the chance to correct it arrived decades later, and the equally quiet grace required to receive an apology without allowing bitterness to become its final chapter. Naomi stood quietly, holding the letter in one hand while the ballroom seemed to disappear around her. The applause that usually celebrated success still refused to arrive because no one wanted to interrupt the rare honesty unfolding before them. Jonathan slowly extended the legal documents toward her, but Naomi did not immediately reach for them. Instead, she looked across the room at the young servers clearing empty glasses, the housekeeping staff waiting respectfully near the service entrance, and the maintenance employees who had quietly helped transform the ballroom before dawn. She recognized nearly every face because they were the people who greeted one another with tired smiles before sunrise, shared coffee during short breaks, and celebrated birthdays with homemade cakes in small break rooms far away from elegant banquets. Taking a slow breath, Naomi finally spoke. "If I accept this," she said gently, "it cannot become the ending of one person's story. It has to become the beginning of many others." Jonathan listened without interrupting. His father's letter rested safely in Naomi's hand now, but he realized its greatest purpose had not been to restore the past. It had been to reveal the kind of person Naomi had always been. Harold Benson quietly smiled, almost as though Richard Ashford had anticipated this exact response decades earlier. Naomi continued, "When I was young, I wanted to become a teacher. Life asked something different of me, and I never regretted caring for my family. But I met hundreds of children over the years who carried dreams much bigger than their circumstances. They never needed someone to rescue them. They only needed someone willing to open a door." A deep silence settled once again. Several guests lowered their eyes, reflecting on opportunities they themselves had once received from teachers, neighbors, mentors, or complete strangers whose names history would never remember. Jonathan slowly folded the legal papers before placing them back inside the folder. "Then let us open those doors together," he replied. "The trust will not exist to honor our family name. It will exist to honor the future my father hoped you would build." Naomi finally accepted the folder, not as a reward, but as a responsibility. She looked toward Harold. "Can the trust provide scholarships for students who have delayed their education because they chose to care for family first?" Harold answered almost immediately. "Yes." Richard gave broad authority to the trustee once the conditions were fulfilled. Naomi smiled softly for the first time that evening. "Then that is where it begins." Jonathan nodded without hesitation. "And I will personally ensure every administrative cost is covered separately. Every dollar inside the trust will belong to the students it was meant to serve." The words echoed gently through the ballroom. What had begun as an unexpected confession had quietly transformed into a shared promise. Even those who had questioned Jonathan only minutes earlier now understood they were witnessing something that could not be measured on a financial statement. It was the rare moment when regret became generosity. Generosity became opportunity, and one forgotten act of kindness reached forward across generations to shape lives that neither Richard Ashford nor Naomi Carter would ever fully know, yet both had chosen to believe were worth investing in. 1 year later, the first morning sunlight stretched across the red brick walls of a newly restored community learning center on the south side of Chicago. The building was modest, surrounded by young maple trees and a small playground where children laughed before the doors even opened. Fresh paint reflected the golden light, and colorful murals created by local students covered the once empty exterior walls. Above the entrance, carved into a simple limestone plaque, were 5 words that quietly welcomed every family who arrived. The Naomi Carter Education Foundation. There was no mention of the Ashford family name anywhere on the building. That had been Jonathan's decision from the very beginning. He insisted that the story should never become about the family that had delayed a promise. It should always belong to the woman whose kindness had inspired it. Inside, classrooms buzzed with hopeful conversations as scholarship recipients unpacked notebooks, greeted teachers, and spoke excitedly about futures that finally seemed possible. Some were young parents returning to college after raising children. Others had postponed their education to care for aging relatives. A few had spent years working night shifts before daring to believe that another chapter of life could still begin. Naomi slowly walked through the hallways, greeting each student by name whenever she could. She had never become the elementary school teacher she once imagined, yet somehow life had gently returned her to the place where she had always belonged. Every encouraging smile, every patient conversation, every open classroom door reminded her that dreams sometimes arrived by roads no one could predict. Jonathan stood quietly near a window overlooking the courtyard, watching children chase one another beneath the autumn leaves. He carried no prepared speech and sought no attention from reporters gathered outside. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and removed his late father's silver pocket watch, the one Richard had carried through decades of business meetings and family milestones. Jonathan looked at it for a long moment before placing it inside a small glass display beside the foundation's entrance. Beneath it rested a single handwritten sentence copied from Richard's letter. "Do not inherit my hesitation." Visitors paused to read those words before continuing inside, never realizing how many years of regret had finally been transformed into hope. Naomi joined Jonathan near the entrance. They exchanged a quiet smile that needed no explanation. Neither spoke about debts anymore because the debt had already become something greater than repayment. It had become opportunity. As the morning breeze drifted through the open doors, the sounds of children reading aloud filled the building with gentle energy. The laughter echoed down bright hallways where possibility now lived instead of regret. Jonathan glanced once more toward the engraved name above the entrance before stepping back into the crowd without introducing himself to anyone. Naomi remained by the doorway, watching another group of students arrive with backpacks over their shoulders and determination in their eyes. She gently touched the weathered envelope she still carried inside her handbag, then looked toward the rising sun. Some promises arrive late. Some dreams wait longer than they should. But kindness, when remembered with courage and answered with integrity, can still become the future someone else has been waiting for all along.